The largest outbreak of cholera in the Middle East in decades continues to spread in Syria and Lebanon, which has claimed over 100 lives to date and has been detected in water supplies as far afield as Israel. While the international community and local authorities have launched a multi-layered campaign to address the threat to public health, the outbreak and attempts to deal with it to date are but the latest symptom of state collapse in Syria and Lebanon. Cholera is contracted by ingesting food or water contaminated with the bacterium Vibrio cholera, which causes intestinal problems that are sometimes severe enough to lead to dehydration. The disease can kill within a few hours if left untreated, with the highest mortality among children, the elderly, and frail. Outbreaks spread rapidly in areas where people do not have access to clean water or practice good hygiene. In Syria, where the population is much weakened and the water sanitation infrastructure has been devastated by more than 11 years of conflict, the bacteria has spread rapidly. The outbreak's point of origin remains unclear, with the United Nations putting the epicenter in northeast Syria and the Assad regime in Aleppo province. Since the first cases were reported in late August, the highest numbers are in Deir ez-Zor, Idlib, Raqqa, and Aleppo. On November 11th, the Israeli Ministry of Health announced that cholera had been detected in the Yarmouk River, which runs along the Syrian, Israeli, and Jordanian frontier. As of mid-December, the United Nations reports nearly 57,000 suspected cases. Of Syria's pre-war population of 22 million, 17 million remain in the country, and an estimated 5 million are in neighboring countries and beyond. Of those remaining in Syria, 12 million are in Assad regime-controlled areas, and approximately 5 million reside in areas controlled by the United States-supported Syrian Democratic Forces and the Turkish-backed opposition groups. Over the course of the war, an estimated 2/3 of Syria's water treatment plants, half of the country's pumping stations, and 1/3 of its water storage has been damaged and is more often than not out of commission due to power outages. In short, most sewage in Syria is discharged untreated and is now mixing with fresh water supplies and flowing downstream into rivers and tributaries beyond Syria's borders. The international response in Syria, which is in a state of de facto partition due to the outcome of the war, has taken multiple vectors. According to a December 10 United Nations report on the outbreak, over 2 million doses of oral cholera vaccine are now being administered in Aleppo, Hasakeh, Raqqa, and Deir ez-Zor provinces. The United Nations has worked with local authorities to improve water sanitation and hygiene, including improving access to safe water through deliveries of water chlorination supplies and fresh water itself, including to internally displaced person camps and schools.
Cholera spread to Lebanon in early October, marking the country's first cholera outbreak since 1993. The first recorded cases in Lebanon were in North and Akkar governorates, with the first case involving a Syrian man from an informal settlement in the Min Yidlniya district, which is also in the north. Those governorates remain the most impacted throughout the country. The spread is particularly worrisome for young children, with 29% of cholera cases in Lebanon affecting those aged between 0 and 4. 21% of Lebanese who have contracted the virus required hospitalization. Following the emergence of the first confirmed case of cholera in Lebanon on October 4, Lebanon's public health authorities quickly announced a cholera outbreak on October 6. On October 31, France stepped in by providing vaccines against cholera, helping to deliver 13,000 doses from the philanthropic arm of the French healthcare company Sanofi. The United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund, CERF, and Lebanon's Humanitarian Fund announced a 9.5 million aid package to stop the spread of cholera in Lebanon on November 10. By December 1, 457,251 cholera vaccine had been delivered. As of December 19, there are 5,328 cumulative suspected and confirmed cholera cases in the country, according to the Lebanon's Ministry of Public Health. Towards the end of December 2022, the number of cases decreased, but that does not mean that the cholera spread is over. There are studies coming out that some of the rivers in Lebanon, especially the big rivers, the Litani, has been contaminated with cholera, and there are other reports that the Euphrates, also that goes from Syria to Iraq, is also contaminated with cholera, which means that the virus, which is so far has been contained between Lebanon and Syria, will eventually reach neighboring countries through these rivers.
As the international community continues to manage the problem, solving the cholera outbreak will require addressing the corrosive problem of state breakdown in Syria and Lebanon, for which there are no easy answers anytime soon. Months after the reports of the first outbreak surfaced, data on cases vary considerably across Syria and Lebanon, confounding attempts to manage the crisis. Despite recent agreement at the UN between the Biden administration and Russia to include water treatment plants as early recovery projects that are exempt from international sanctions on Syria, the country's continued partition between regime-held areas dominated by Russia and Iran and other areas controlled by proxies supported by Turkey and the United States continue to complicate and slow the construction of water treatment facilities. As does the economic collapse in both Syria and Lebanon, with fuel shortages leading to severe contraction in local government services such as electricity. Even if the estimated 200 or so water projects outlined in Syria were to be constructed, there is little or no electricity to power them.
Much of the international response has been focused on medical treatment and prevention measures, such as vaccines and wastewater treatment in most affected areas. The goal of the international health and medical organizations is to stop the spread and contain the disease. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. And the problem is not medical, right? The problem, we know that this is happening because of the state collapse, the collapse of state institutions. And the issue really here, if you patch this problem up with vaccines and medications, you're only solving one small repercussion of the main problem, which is state collapse. So for example, today, if you look at the state institutions and you see that all the vaccine coming through the health ministry and some of the health sector institutions, the problem is Lebanon doesn't really have civil servants anymore. So who is going to work to get the water cleaned? Or what engineers are left in the water establishment in order to, fix the water and drains and actually, clean the rivers that are contaminated with cholera? Who is going to take care of the sick and distribute the medication? There is actually no one working. The rest of the institutions, not just the health institutions, we're talking about across the board failed state with no civil servant. You look at Lebanon, and I'm sure it's the same in Syria. You look at Lebanon and you see basically the government, caretaking government, no president, the parliament, which is barely a state, but even that is better than the core of the institutions, which is the civil servant. I'll give you an example here of, for example, according to the national water strategy that was made by the government, we were supposed to have in Lebanon 1,100 positions, additional positions, in order to make the country function. So far, the establishment currently only consists of 300 employees. And these 300 employees are not showing up to work. And if you think about it, most of the engineers who actually usually can find job elsewhere outside Lebanon or in the private sector definitely are leaving. There's a brain drain from the state institutions. And this is really contributing to the collapse of the state institutions. It's not about the president. It's not about the government formation. It's not the political issue, the local political issues. It's really the fact that people are no longer able to get to work because they cannot afford taxis or gas to fill up their tanks. So the core of the institutions has collapsed. There's no one to do the job. The state has collapsed. The problem is three layers, right? The problem is the medical issue, which is now we see it via cholera, and there's a new disease coming out. Like we haven't talked about the next step. This is the tip of the iceberg, because if you think about it, there's, the H1N1, which is the bird flu, is spreading in Lebanon, and no one can deal with it because there's no hospitals functioning unless you can afford it. So the health issue is just a repercussion of the serious issue, which is the state's collapse. And the state collapse is happening because the deeper, more serious issue that will prevent a state collapse or rebuild the state is political. And political in the sense of that those who are actually today protecting corruption and resisting reforms are political figures. And we're talking mainly about the corrupt political class and Hezbollah, which is providing the protective umbrella for all this corruption. None of this is going to be solved without targeting the main issue in Lebanon, which is the political umbrella that is protecting the corruption.
In Syria, we see similar dynamics, but for different reasons. The Syrian state broke down over 11 years ago and counting. And so the Assad regime controls about 2/3 of the territory in Syria, and the remainder is between Turkish-backed groups and US groups. The problem, though, is over the last few years, the exchange rate of the Syrian pound has plummeted, some of which is due to external sanctions, but most of which is due to just the continued destruction and lack of rebuilding inside of the country, the lack of economic output. And so that means that the Syrian state is still paying the same salaries as they did in the past.
Same here.
But for nearly pennies on the dollar.
Yeah.
And so now the Syrian regime gave a bonus the other day, which amounted to a whopping only $16 to all public employees, hoping to make it easier on them to be able to buy fuel, which is far, far more expensive on the open market. So in the case of Syria, we have not only the partition of the country, but the lack of state services and local services means that containing something like cholera is ultimately doable through working on the edges, but the ultimate source, raw sewage and fresh water blending together, is impossible without the construction of water sanitation facilities that haven't even started in the country, and there is no money to pay for it.
Yes.
And even in the cases where there is international money to pay for it, they're all held up through different kinds of bureaucratic red tape. So there's no way to stop the breakdown as long as we don't have some kind of agreement from the international community in particular about how to provide aid to Syria.
Yeah.
And the aid to Syria, as we know, is subject to now a vote every 6 months before the UN Security Council on cross-border assistance, which is nominally about the flow of aid into opposition areas, but ultimately is also related to the provision of aid by the UN, also in Assad regime-controlled territory.
And you do, like in Syria, they do also, I think, I'm assuming they have the same issue of civil servants not showing up to work, right? So it is, or do they have a different system where, because, you know, there's like Lebanon is collapsing because of different reasons, but the two countries are linked. However, in Syria, there's a dictator regime, right? So it's like, can people actually decide not to go to work? Or is it like up to them?
Syrians have multiple jobs at the same time to make ends meet. So they do nominally collect a salary, but it's worth less and less. And in many cases now, the state is unable to pay their employees as the inflation rate increases inside of the country. So it's a bit like monopoly money. But the larger problem is that the state is unable to maintain subsidies on such things as diesel fuel and other basic commodities that support the production of bread.
So people can go to work. Yeah.
Correct. So now everyone is staying home. And with staying home, you have lack of economic output. And also now a major push in the country to try and deal with the energy issue has been to encourage Syrians to actually stay home by giving them early vacations before the Christmas holiday. So in many ways, the state's not just breaking down, but society is slowly calming down and being calmed down in order to deal with this impending very rough and predictably cold winter.
It's amazing how these two countries are facing very, very similar problems, right? But also it's amazing that the region, these issues, the security issues, the health issues, the medical issues, everything, the social collapse also that we're talking about, this is not going to be contained in Lebanon and Syria. It's like the cholera cannot be contained in Syria. It was migrated to Lebanon because, you know, like this region is not separated. And it's interesting that the Iranians, for example, see this region as one big entity, but the West treat this region as separate entities. So when cholera breaks out in Lebanon, they focus on how to solve it in Lebanon without looking at the big picture of, you know, there's a policy where, you know, like you can see it. And if you look at the map, you can see it, that the rivers and underground water, if they're contaminated with cholera, this is going to spread from Syria to Lebanon. We saw it happening. But eventually, the Euphrates goes into Iraq, the Yarmouk goes into Jordan, the Litani is like everywhere. The underground water is also an issue, you know, like you cannot not see this happening, and vaccine is not going to solve the problem. And the problem again is if this is spilling out that easily via war, imagine like a security incident, imagine a conflict, imagine a social outbreak, imagine refugees going into boats and leaving. with all the issues they're bringing from Lebanon. It's unbelievable how the policy is only focused on compartmentalizing the problem with each country, and then each country alone separate from the rest of the region, although you see it happening all over the place. You know, like Iran has been looking at Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza even, as one big entity, and they have one policy for the whole thing, and that's been working for them. A lot of other people do not see that, and they compartmentalize the problem in a way that it keeps spilling over. It's amazing.
In Syria, the response in terms of the humanitarian suffering in the country is always divorced from the political process. And while that's appropriate because people deserve that humanitarian support regardless of what side they're on, the fact is if you don't link the humanitarian support to some kind of progress on the political process that should settle the Syrian war, and just getting us on the road to such things as the Constitutional Committee or release of prisoners and the whole process that's outlined in UN Security Council Resolution 2254, you have no real hope of solving the ultimate issue that's generating the state failure in Syria.
Yep. This is unfortunately, we're talking about these things, but there is like not a single solution for it. There are so many issues that needs to be targeted. And again, it's a matter of bandwidth and focus and who can do what. And today, a little cholera outbreak in Lebanon and Syria is obviously not a priority for anyone. Unfortunately, it will become an issue when it spreads to Jordan and Iraq and the rest of the region.